It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in Take Command podcast with Logan Paulsen. I am Craig Hoffman, and this will be our one and only podcast this week. Schedule, actually, I was off by a week last week, Logan. Whoopsie daisies. Too many practices, not enough looking at the calendar. So there is no open practice this week for OTAs. It's the off week for the Commanders. There will be open practice next week, and then 2 weeks from now, there will be a ton of podcastage and a ton of stuff for us to look at because that is the mandatory week. And so all three practices are open, assuming that they do three. They might just do the two and then everybody goes home early. That often happens for the veteran camp. But Logan, what we're going to do today is something we've talked about doing for a while. And now in the middle of summer here, the middle of spring, we have the chance to actually do it, which is a deep dive into the air raid offense. Now, of course, Kliff Kingsbury said, this isn't an air raid offense. This is going to be something different. We're going to build the Commanders offense. But there are facets of the air raid that are absolutely going to make it into what Kliff does because that's how he came up. And so I thought it would be fun, and we thought it would be fun to kind of really get into what is the air raid, like what makes it different, where did it come from, and what do we think will translate into Kliff Kingsbury's 2024 Washington Commanders offense based on what we've seen from him in Arizona and whatever else we think goes into this formula. Logan, before we get into the history of the air raid offense, anything else you'd like to add up front about the air raid and why you wanted to take this deep dive?
Well, I think part of it is just because you hear so many people say, oh, it's like air raid is this. And I think the more that I just wanted to kind of get a feel for like what the language is like, how they call plays, like what are they looking for? And I think the thing, we'll talk about this in more detail. It's just offense. It's just an offense. It's abiding by normal principles. And I mean like normal in the sense you're trying to put stress on the defense. You're trying to, create mismatches. You're trying to find advantages that fit you and put the defense at a disadvantage. And I think ultimately that's what every offense in the NFL is trying to do. So I think it's only natural that when you look around the league, you look at Kansas City, you look at elements of Kyle's offense, you look at elements of Mike McDaniel's offense, there's traditional air raid concepts in there. And I think there's some delineation here in terms of what is spread, what is air raid, there's a little bit of we're splitting hairs there, but I think that's going to be a fun conversation. And ultimately, I think what I'm hoping people get out of this is just the scheme doesn't really matter as long as you're abiding by good offensive game plan principles.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I think another part that as you sent me some stuff and was reading about the air raid myself, hearing Mike Leach talk about what you need out of a quarterback in this system is the stuff that I think I would really prioritize out of a quarterback. Do you have someone that understands space? Do you have someone that understands different concepts and reads and can make decisions on the fly and read things out in real time? And Mike Leach, he's given some coaching seminars and stuff over the years where he talks about exactly that. If you want this system to work at its maximal capacity, you need a quarterback that can make plays, that can quickly delineate between coverages and read space and maybe find a different window than the one you drew on paper. And in that way, there's a real kind of almost basketball, soccer, where's the space? Let's play into it element to the air raid that I think is really fun. On a baseline level, the air raid is traditionally run out of shotgun, a lot of 10 personnel, so 4 wide receivers, 1 tight end, or 4 wide receivers, 1 running back. I should say 10 or 0-1 personnel, depending on the version, but 10 most specifically, 1 running back, no tight ends, 4 receivers. And it started way back. I mean, it's funny. I'm looking at the Wikipedia page now, Logan. There's actually the term air raid offense appeared in print as early as 1941 to describe the offense of the Indiana Hoosiers football team, which was long adept in filling the air with well-aimed passes under Coach Bo McMillan. You got to love the old 1941 sports writing.
Yeah, no, but I think it's kind of the version that we are familiar with started in Kentucky, right? Right. With,
so it ultimately it makes its way to the big time with Kentucky. Hal Mumme is the head coach at the time. Mike Leach is the OC and an assistant underneath him, and they see they're watching tape of someone else, and they face someone, and they are like, oh, this 2-minute offense thing, the tempo, the spread, like we can do this all the time. And at the time they're at Iowa Wesleyan, and then they ultimately take it to Valdosta State, and then they go to University of Kentucky starting in 97. And then all of a sudden, Tim Couch is the number 1 overall pick in the draft, and he's putting up monster numbers. And it kind of that's where the tree starts.
Yeah.
But I think one thing that we both learned, Logan, in terms of like the history of the air raid is just how wide that tree got was pretty astounding.
It did get really wide. And I think like, so this is the other thing. Like, I'm always a guy, like, I think of it in like a very scientific kind of way, so like why was this even a point of conversation? And basically, like, at the time, like, people were running the football a ton. Like, you've got Nebraska with like that kind of, the triple option offense. You've got like all of these kind of powerful schools, and so what you get is like powerful defenses. And I think one of the cool things about these air raid coaches is they were like, if our opponent's strong, like, let's be fast. And I think that what they did is like when you add speed, when you add receivers, like, you're naturally cultivating mismatches. And I think when you look at, like, I remember going down to tight end university and watching film from like when Peyton Manning was quarterback of the Colts, like Dallas Clark was doing a talk, right? And they were in 11 personnel. And the defense was in base. They were in base defense. And so if you're in 11 personnel with 3 wide receivers and a tight end, you automatically, just by body type standard, have a mismatch, right? You have this linebacker who's 240 pounds. He's used to taking on fullbacks, who has to cover a slot wide receiver. And so, like, I think it's really brilliant. They said, well, why don't we just do that more? And then don't let the defense adjust, right? We'll keep their big personnel on the field. We'll go hurry up. They can't call these exotic pressures. We're going to insulate our offensive line through tempo. And it kind of took off. And I think you see, again, we've talked about this a bunch already, just kind of high level, but you see that those principles making they've infected the NFL. Like that is the NFL now. Like, and I think when you look, I think it's the New England Patriots in 2007, like, they're running with Wes Welker, they're running essentially from a drop back pass game standpoint, like air raid concepts, And so I think, like, that's the thing about it, is they just took a principle and they said, like, well, how do we maximize what we do and put the defense at an advantage? It's like, let's get better pass catchers against worse coverage players, and we'll win those matchups 9 out of 10 times. And I think that's, again, we'll maybe talk about this on a different show or maybe at the end of this one, but like, that's why you see defenses getting into, like, do we have a dime linebacker? Do we have a star? Do we have a big nickel to kind of like reciprocate these matchups and say, how do we kind of now match this speed that's on the field? So I think, again, you mentioned Hal Mumme, you mentioned Mike Leach and their time at Kentucky, and like, that's essentially what they're doing. And teams just did not have an answer for them. And it's not like they're doing anything crazy. Like, when you look at the concepts, it's not like, oh my God, the air raid is this insane thing. No, it's like pretty straightforward, especially in that early iteration. It's like a call is like a formation. So it's like a color. I think it's like green or blue. And then it's a number, 92. And the 9 delineates protection and the 2 delineates pass concepts. So they only have 9 pass concepts. They just ran them really fast. You couldn't get them matched up. And they had a lot of nuance and adjustment within those pass concepts, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah, and the other big thing here is to make the defenses defend every blade of grass, he said. I was just watching, before we started recording, an NFL Films clip you sent me on Mike Leach, which is on YouTube if anybody wants to find it, like The Pirate. They put it together shortly after Leach passed a couple of years ago. And Leach is in here from like a 2006 clip when he's at Texas Tech, talking about how we're basically the wishbone but pass. Like, the wishbone is designed to make defenses have to make decisions, put them in conflict, and defend every blade of grass. The only difference is they do it with immense amounts of running the football, and we're doing it passing. A very disciplined running game is what he says. And then he's like, we do it with a very disciplined passing game, which I think there's a lot of truth to that in the West Coast system too. There, it's just more balanced than the air raid, which traditionally is 65, 75%, some places even higher pass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to be clear there, like, I know that sounds crazy, but one of the things that the wishbone does a great job of is, like, everyone in that offense, like, touches the football. You get those 3 backs back there. You got the quarterback, the tailback, and the fullback, whatever they're actually called. Some people call them a spinner, whatever you want to call it. But they all touch the football, and then they have these kind of wing backs. Those guys touch the football. And so basically, like, that principle applies to the air raid, but they're just throwing the football. And I think the thing about the wishbone that's so fun, for those of you that are familiar, it's basically like a it's like an option offense, right? But you're kind of doing like quick, tight handoffs in the backfield to kind of misdirect defense's eyes and create misfits. Now, that sounds like a total opposite. Like when you hear Mike Leach say that, you're like, oh, that doesn't make any sense because those offenses stand in opposition to each other. But I think what you're looking at is now we're just going to take that bunch formation and we're going to spread it out. And so our conflicts are going to be much more clear for the quarterbacks to see, right? So for example, like if just like simple math, right? If you have empty personnel, right? You've got 5 wide receivers and they want to play man coverage, right? You have to have 3 and 2, and that should be declared. You can play some type of 2-man, but like I can see the defense and I can see the matchups individually that I want to see before the ball's even been hiked. If they have to declare pressure, I can see it. If they're dropping into zone coverage because of the space, they can't hide rotation the same way. So essentially, it's doing the same thing, but it's creating conflict by going from tight to wide. And then it says we got to make sure every one of these guys in this offense touches the football to maximize what we do. And I think that's really brilliant because if you think about, again, in the era of offense where this offense was generated, it was like we have our X receiver, we have our Z receiver, the tight end's going to block and the fullback's going to block and the running back's going to run the football. So you're really only throwing the football to 2 people. And now, again, you've elaborated, and people say, oh, like this seems very obvious. But in this era of football, it was not obvious, right? So we've created matchups because people can't cover the same way. It's kind of like what Stanford did in the Pac-12 in like 2010, 2011, where they were like, we're going to run power. And everyone's running all these spread offenses. They're spreading the field. We're going to run power. And basically people didn't have the personnel to match up and fit power. The air raid was the reverse of that. It was like, we don't have enough people to cover. And so I think that's, again, like if you look at the history of football and why this is so important, it becomes so clear now why air raid is everywhere in the NFL, because these are principles that are every single weekend you see them.
For sure. And I think it's why we're seeing a return to the run game in the NFL now, is because defenses got so light, not only on the back end, where it's like how many coverage guys can we get, but up front, there's such a prioritization of let's get pass rushers and maybe guys that are a little lighter and quicker and they can help out in the screen game a little bit more and cover a little bit more space. We don't need these big, like, lane stuffing, 2-block eating defensive tackles or, God forbid, defensive ends anymore that can't run in space. And now teams are like, well, shoot, we got these really light defensive ends. Let's get a little bit bigger O linemen and let's run it down their throat. And we saw last year a return outside of Washington to the run game at levels that we haven't seen in like 20 years.
Right.
And so I think there's always a cyclical nature, but you also, like, what I like about the air raid, and we're going to talk in a minute about how unique this is to air raid, or perhaps not. What I like on like a fundamental level of what Leach and all these guys are trying to do is they are trying to make defenses make decisions, and they are relying on the fact that often, like, their guys are going to have to make decisions too, and whether it's a quarterback making a read or a receiver sight adjusting a route in real time, but because this is what we do and we do it every week, and by the way, we also know what's coming because we're the offense, we're going to make our decisions faster and more accurately than you. And most of the time, we're going to, as long as we execute well, you can't actually be right anyway. Like there's only, like, you're going to have to give up something. And as a defense, your goal would be to give up the least damaging thing and then, rally and tackle and hopefully get off the field with a couple of checkdowns. But at the end of the day, like, this offense is designed with the route concepts and some of the freedom that's given both the quarterback pre-snap and the quarterback and receivers post-snap to make it so the defense can't be right. And there's a very fluid nature to that, which also means you need really smart football players, which I think is why a lot of quarterbacks have come out of this system. Yeah, there's certainly been some busts that have come out of it. Every system has that. But you've got Mahomes, you've got Baker, who's had a pretty solid little career here. You've got guys like even Gardner Minshew is one of the better backups in the league that come from this system that their ability to read defenses and make decisions and handle a lot mentally is born in the fact that they've been asked to do that since they got in the air raid in college.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's just, again, like you mentioned, this like horizontal space distribution element. And like I think about kind of like day one install for the air raid is like 2x2 pass set. You know what I'm saying? And so like if there's 2x2, there's a running back in the backfield. He's usually in the gun. And so you can run the football in the air raid, obviously, right? And so what they do is the defense matches with 6 guys in the box because you have 6 rushers. And so in that coverage structure, let's say I'm playing like a cover 2, and I'm running an out to the left with like a what they call like a Y high cross coming across. That hook player that's in the box now that has to stop the run also has to cover the 5-yard out, like just based on the spacing, right? If you're playing good sound run defense. And so like as a quarterback, I get to the line of scrimmage, and I just look out because of the space, and I say, well, this guy's in conflict from the snap, from alignment. I can get him the football. And let's say they do widen that out. If I'm smart, and this is one of the things about the air raid, because the playbook is so tight, it allows you to have a lot of flexibility in terms of changing stuff at the line of scrimmage. I'm the quarterback. I notice we've got a 5-man box. We have 5 blockers and a running back. That advantage favors us. Let's run the football. And I think like that's essentially what you're getting out of this stuff, which is awesome. And I think the other thing like that you were alluding to there too is because the play volume was so small, you get all of these adjustments, right? You get, versus this coverage on our mesh concept, we're going to do this. Versus stick versus this coverage, we're going to do this. And we're going to have all these little side adjustments. And there's not only side adjustments where it's like we're reading man or zone. It's like, if we get cover 3, like we're running a post on the outside. You know what I'm saying? Like there's just a huge plethora of things. And I think, and again, like which came first, the chicken or the egg, but like in every offense that I was in, with Kyle, with Sean, with Dow Loggins up in Chicago, like with Sarkisian down in Atlanta, like that's an element of offense now. And the problem is it's hard because of the play volume to consistently make those side adjustments. But when the play volume's small, not only can the receiver and the quarterback consistently see when and how they need to make those adjustments, but they also, like this is a great thing. I think we saw this in OTAs in the last OTA practice, is the quarterback can just change the play because we only have like 15 of them. So I can just call the one I want versus cover 3 if I'm confident in the coverage, and I can just let that ball rip. So I think the flexibility it gives the quarterback, the ownership it gives the quarterback, the vision it gives the quarterback. And again, like last year with Sam Howell, when he was playing really well early in the season, that's one of the benefits of spreading defenses out is it declares matchups and alignments at a high level. So to your point about like this tree of quarterbacks that have kind of perforated the league, it's taking basic kind of NFL quarterback stuff and letting you do more of it in college than other offenses because of the flexibility, because of the truncated playbook, which I think is really cool. So again, like there's this negative connotation with the air raid, but like I just see like that's what you want to do. Like when you're calling plays, like that's what it is. It's like this guy's leverage pre-snap. This guy's leverage in a bad way. I know because of the splits, they can't hide this rotation. This is the coverage. Let's get this guy the ball. Like you talk about stuff that Tom Brady does, and I think you mentioned this like 2 podcasts ago. Like one of the best things he does is he understands the coverage pre, post, and then knows where the football should go before his back foot hits the ground. And that's because he's studied and done a lot of learning. But also, I think the air raid, especially in college because of the hashes, allows you to do it right now. Like you can, like we're lined up, and if you're not correct, like that guy's getting the ball, and a blind man could see it, kind of thing. So
yeah. I want to get to some of the holes, if you will, in the air raid in a second. I also want to do kind of the West Coast air raid, whatever other systems we want to comparison. Yeah. But the last thing, real quick before we get to that stuff, is there's almost a playground element to it that I love when you talk about the finding space, right? Like if you and I were playing pickup football and in the backyard, our families get together for Thanksgiving or whatever, and I'm like, all right, Logan, if he's outside, I want you to run inside. If he's inside, I want you to run outside. Right? Like if we're doing that, great. And as long as we have the stuff around it to provide a little bit of structure, ultimately it's just like run to where the space is. And not everyone can run to where the space is because then everyone just runs together. But like you give these little things, like you mentioned, that are in other offenses now for sure. And who knows who stole from where. But from go, really the air raid has been like, okay, yeah, this is a vertical route, but it's a go against certain leverages and certain coverages. It's a post against whatever, because we're going to find ways to put defenders in conflict, or we're going to isolate certain guys. And I guess that we can even transition right into it, right? Because I definitely know that Kyle and Sean and everybody in the West Coast system has adopted parts of these too, where there are these site adjustments and you bend routes a certain way. 4 verts is not always, and typically actually isn't, 4 straight vertical lines. right? You have, against certain coverages, you're going to bend it because otherwise you just run right into the defenders. One thing that I will say is interesting about air raid is sometimes they do that on purpose. And it's like, well, if we run 4 guys straight into the defenders, well, they become 4 man-to-man matchups. We just pick our matchup. And now we got a dude out there on a not quite as dude, and we're going to throw the ball to our dude. So like there is that element to it. But when you started to watch some of this air raid stuff, how familiar was it? Because there is mesh, there is stick, there is 4 verts, there is, high Y cross and some of the, all that kind of stuff. How different actually is it in terms of the coaching points, in terms of how these routes are bent, in terms of where they appear to be putting emphasis to the offenses that you predominantly ran in your NFL career, which were West Coast?
Yeah. So, I think like basically when you look at every air raid concept, there will be an NFL analogous to it, right? There'll be an NFL play, depending on the verbiage, depending on the team, that'll be very, very similar. And so I think like with regards to the air raid, like I think Kansas City's a really interesting example. So like the one thing about the air raid that I think kind of handcuffs you a little bit in terms of true air raid, and this is where I think Kliff is like, hey man, we're not running the air raid because we have more flexibility, is the truncated nature of the play call. So remember we talked about like the color is the color is formation and then 92. And again, they can tag stuff here. They can be like, 92 Y takeoff or whatever the call is. You know what I'm saying? But one of the things, it makes it hard. It makes it hard to kind of create a nuanced protection profile. It makes it hard to create nuanced formations where it's like, hey man, like we have all of these different words. Like, I think one of the things about Kyle's offense, there's probably, I'd have to check exactly, but close to 50 words just for formations and formational tags, because you want to be able to put your best players where you want them for certain routes. In the air raid, you lose some of that flexibility. But I think when you look at like Kansas City, that's a West Coast offense in terms of verbiage, right? Predominantly, like it's a verbiage offense. So what they do is they have all these words that are for protections and for formations and for different route concepts and for different tags. But what they've done is they said, we're going to fit these air raid concepts into this West Coast language. So we still have the flexibility we want with some of the simplicity and some of the adjustability of concept that you get from the air raid stuff. And I think that to me is like really what you're looking at when you're taking an air raid offense to the NFL. So I think you mentioned 4 verts, like 4 verts, maybe smash is better. Like, so smash is like, some people say it's a 5-yard stop and a corner. Some people say it's a 5-yard stop and a big box fade. But like one of the things about smash at the NFL level is like, if you get cover 2, for example, that can adjust to 4 verts because then you're getting a press corner on the outside. You don't want to run a hitch to press corner. You want to run a go, right? So that'll adjust. And if it's cover 2, then I, as the seam runner, know that I have to bend inside of the cover 2 safety's face, right? Like I have to bend that automatically, right? Or if it's quarters, I basically run like an in. It'll look like almost like a 90-degree cut because I want to get in front of that guy, but it's still 4 verts. So those types of adjustments, again, I don't know where the influence came from, but taking ownership of the concept as a player allows you to basically be right versus every coverage. So like I can run 4 verts if that's what we're doing. And like there's stories of Mike Leach running 4 verts for entire practices, right? Like we're only running 4 verts as a pass concept. And people say that's stupid. Why would you do that? But it allows you as a player to be like, oh, versus cover 3, I'm going to run it like this. Versus cover 4, I'm going to run it like this. And versus cover 2, I'm going to run it like this. And basically the defense will never be right if we run it the way we're supposed to run it. And I think like when you look at high-level offenses, and specifically Kansas City, I'm going to highlight Travis Kelce. Like he is awesome at just being like, this play is dead versus this coverage. I'm going to stop right where I'm at. And Patrick Mahomes understands that probably because of the air raid influence that, hey, I know he's dead, but if he does what I think he's going to do, the ball can come out here. And I think that, again, is that flexibility in concept. Like, again, I go back to this all the time with Kansas City, is everyone runs like a post corner with a flat. Every team in the NFL runs that. Versus quarters, if it works correctly, it should be wide open. But versus cover 3 can be a little bit messy, potentially. So, like, if that guy's just going to hang there, that thirds player is going to hang there on the corner, just stop and run a comeback. And Travis Kelce's caught probably 30 balls last year doing that. And so again, that flexibility of concept is in the NFL. It just becomes more challenging because there's a more diverse offensive profile. And I think when you look at the air raid specifically, it's like we have 10 plays. This is how we run them versus every single coverage. And we have all these little side adjustments, little differences, and like we're going to talk about mesh here in a second. But I think to me that's the difference. In college, it's so truncated. In the NFL, it's broader and fit into the language of like a West Coast.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'd be so curious to be able to ask Travis or Pat Mahomes or Andy Reid or anyone that's been there, like, did Travis start doing that and stopping on his own? Was that Pat being like, hey, dude, you can just stop and I'll throw you the football?
So
or is that Andy saying that? Like,
you know what's crazy is down at tight end like he was like, I just mess around in practice. Like, and I think that's a testament to Andy Reid just being like, your stud's a stud, let him be a stud. You know what I'm saying? And like, and I get yelled at. He's like, Travis, like, I get yelled at sometimes, but like sometimes they put in the playbook. And I think like that's what you're looking at from an Andy Reid perspective of basically an innovative offensive mind being like, this looks, we didn't want this, but it looks great. Let's get that done. There's one of the most prolific runs recently in the NFL is this kind of, you're getting like two tight ends they're off the ball, kind of a clamp bunch formation. So 2x2, but it's tight and both tight ends are off the ball. And instead of like having a fullback where like you're in the dot, like kind of right behind the quarterback and the defense can match you. So they would match to the running strength there. So let's say it's strong right. The defense is going to push to the right because the fullback's in the middle. They have the other tight end like jet motion across the formation so the defense can't pre-align to the overloaded run strength. And I was talking to somebody and that happened by accident. But they were like, that works. Let's keep it in. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that's, again, where like offenses are always evolving and always changing. But back to the air raid, like the thing that makes them cool is they are kind of intentionally doing that. They kind of came out from the jump and were like, this is how this offense is going to work. Right.
And so to go back to the 4 verts example, like if I'm a DC and I've got 4 verts coming, quarters is probably what I want.
Yeah.
Like I want to account for 4 vertical routes. Okay, well, let's get 4 deep vertical defenders. And Brett Coleman, who's a great YouTuber, super smart, did a video like 2019, when Kliff was coming in the league, where he broke down some tape, and he was using a lot of Oklahoma tape from that year, and Kyler's about to be the number 1 pick. At the time, this is early enough in the draft process that Brett didn't know. He's like, we'll see where Kyler goes. I'm like, spoiler alert, he's going to go 1. But CeeDee Lamb is the slot receiver on this particular play that he's showing on film. And Brandon Jones, who's actually in the NFL as a safety as well, so he's a good football player. Yeah. But it's the Texas OU game. And they get CeeDee Lamb like matched up one-on-one essentially, even though it's quarters, but CeeDee's in the slot. And they create a matchup. And so when we talk about the defense never being able to be right, that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about, is because they've run these concepts against every different system, both with alignment, creativity, and kind of comfort with the route concepts. But also, I think this is where it gets fun with Kliff and the Commanders potentially, is like with matchups. If the defense knows what's coming, but they're still probably not going to like invert a safety in a corner. So if Terry lines up in the slot, even if they're like 4 verts is coming, McLaurin's going vertical, you're just stuck with a safety on Terry. Or you're stuck with Brandon Jones at Texas on CeeDee Lamb. And so I think that like there's beauty in the simplicity. And we should talk a little bit more in a second on some of the flexibility of the Commanders' pieces. But before I forget this, and before we get too far away with everyone being like, this is the greatest offense ever, why doesn't everybody run it? Because we've been super positive for 30 minutes. What are the weaknesses here? What does it leave to be desired on the table? And then maybe even how has Kliff like overcome that as he evolved the offense in Arizona to the NFL level?
Yeah, so I think the main thing, and I'm really glad you brought up that clip, because like if you're playing in the NFL, like NFL defense, they're not going to run straight quarters to that look. Like, I hate to break it to you, because like, so basically it's like 2x2 and there's a tight end in motion. And so like if I'm the defensive play caller, if I'm a defensive personnel, like first off, the hashes are way tighter, so you lose some of the space. But also, like, we're going to run some type of cover 6 probably. So we're going to match that 2 receiver side because that's a passing strength. I'm going to give that front side safety a little bit more flexibility, like the Jones player in this example, right? And so, like, defenses are way, way more complicated at the NFL level. Like, way more complicated. Like when you look at like Michigan, for example, and how they crushed in college football this last year, that's an NFL defense, and no one knew what to do versus them, right? Because like they have all of these different disguises. They have different rotations. They have these different flexible chess pieces. Are they in cover 6? Are they in quarters? And so those adjustments that are so prevalent in the air raid offense become way more challenging because now you have to identify what the actual heck is going on defensively. So I think that's the thing, is like simplicity is good when you can identify what's happening on the defensive side of the football. Simplicity is bad when the defense is crazy complicated and you don't know what the hell's going on. Like
right.
when
so
if
you're supposed to do one thing versus cover 2 and one thing versus cover 4,
right.
and all of a sudden they're playing cover 6, which is a hybrid of the two,
right.
You can't make two different decisions at once.
Correct. And now the quarterback and you have to be on the same page. And the other thing about the NFL that I think it can't be overstated is the pass rush is so much more efficient. Like, so I think last year we got a front row seat to like, basically Eric Bieniemy was running a version of the air raid, right? We're going to spread them out. We're going to be in gut a ton. And I think there's a lot of efficiency you saw there. Stuff that I was excited about, right? You're like, this is awesome. But the problem is if you're in 5-man protections a lot, ask Wink Martindale. He's like, we can scheme this up and get sacks. Ask Dan Quinn, we can scheme this up and get sacks. So can we diversify our protection portfolio? Can we get in different formations? That's the other thing that allow us to find better mismatches. I think a great example of this is like the Detroit Lions offense. They do a lot of spread stuff. They got Sam Laporta playing receiver. They got Jahmyr Gibbs out wide. They move pieces around, but they get in bunches. They shift to bunches, and those shifts and motions put defense in consternation. And ultimately, that's what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to create consternation. But if you just line up in 2x2, like that's day one install for 90% of defenses, and they know exactly what to do. So that simplicity at the NFL level, because of the complexity of defenses, because of the talent defensively, because of the IQ of defensive players, coupled with the dynamic athletes rushing the passer, it just makes it more challenging. So that's why you see like Kyle, for example, he understands like, Kyle wants to throw the football as much as any offensive coordinator in the NFL. He understands, like, I need to insulate the offensive line. I need to present different looks, running the football, play action, keepers, to put the defense off balance, right? Now, you could say, well, we could do that same thing with the air raid, and you 100% can, but that, to me, is why, traditionally, it doesn't transition well to the NFL, because they take, so, for example, in college football, if I get in 5 wides or spread out 4 wide, like, 4x1 in the backfield, we're going to get a very specific coverage structure. We're going to get cover 2. We're going to get quarters. And I know that every route I run versus that coverage is going to work, right? Because we've talked about all the receivers know the adjustments. The quarterback knows the adjustments. In the NFL, no chance you're getting that. No chance you're getting anything that simple, that straightforward. So I think that's where I'd say, that's, when you look at 2021 and I was watching clips, obviously there's influences of air raid on how he calls the game, the tempo, the spacing, the concepts, but how he gets to them, I think has evolved, and I think he understands the importance of, and even when we were watching OTAs the other day, like they're in the red zone, they shift from a 2x2 to a bunch 3x1 and they motion to a 2x2. Just that forces communication, forces matchups. And I think, so when Kliff says it's not an air raid, I think that's the kind of stuff he's talking about. Conceptually, you're going to see air raid concepts, no doubt, because everyone runs them. But how do we get to them is the thing that's a little bit more layered there.
Right. If an offense has mesh, smash, 4 verts, on down the list of concepts,
stick,
like
stick, high cross, like that, whatever.
If I tell you those are the concepts that an offense is based off of, you're like, okay, I still don't know what offense it is. Like, that's kind of the point, right? Like,
yeah, right.
There's not a lot of like, oh, this is a West Coast only passing concept or a air raid only passing concept at this point in the evolution, because they have come together so much. And, Mike McDaniel has taken air raid stuff and Kyle's taken air raid stuff and Kliff's taken West Coast stuff. And now, like, on this staff, which I think is really fun, is you've got Anthony Lynn, who's got a varied background. You've got Brian Johnson coming from Philly's version of what they were running with some of the quarterback run stuff, which is another thing that can be a part of the air raid, but is not a necessity. Like when Kliff had Mahomes at Texas Tech, they used some of that a little bit more. Obviously, in Oklahoma, Lincoln Riley used that with Kyler quite a bit, and Kliff used that in Arizona with Kyler quite a bit. But you don't have to.
Right.
You've got... Brandon Whedon at Oklahoma State was an air raid quarterback who had an awesome year as a 152-year-old in college, but like that dude wasn't running anywhere. And so I think that at the end of the day, like the mesh and meld of everything is going to be pretty fascinating. and Kliff's continued evolution on NFL proofing the system to get to the things that he wants, to make sure that with the constraints of space due to hashes, faster players, longer players, like we talk about space, like just the fact that you've eliminated some of the, sorry to these incredibly talented college football players, but inferior athletes who don't jump as high and whose arms aren't as long, like that's another 2-3 inches on a window. And go watch any throw over the middle on slow motion replay in the NFL. Those throws are missing fingertips by that much.
Right.
And so if all of a sudden those throws are that much more difficult, you go from a college like we can put up 6,000 yards in a season to those throws aren't available at all. And so I think that that's also really interesting of how Kliff has, through his time in Arizona, found ways to do it. And also you see the Kansas Cities of the world, et cetera, taking some of these air raid elements into a West Coast offense and taking kind of the best of both worlds and who knows what it'll be called 10 years from now, whatever in the Mahomes offense is.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's 100% right. So I think that, I think that's the thing that I'm most excited for, because everywhere Kliff's gone, like it's changed, right? Like I think 2021 is a perfect example. Like you're watching games, you're like, I was watching the Seattle game, and they're in a lot of air raid stuff, and I think part of the reason, more spread out. So I'm not even going to say air raid. They're just kind of in more open formations, right? And they're not running the ball a ton, but I think because Seattle plays a very simplistic coverage structure. And then you come out the next week versus Dallas, so week 17, I think, and they're running power. They're running, they've got multiple tight ends. They're inserting guys. They're running heavy play action. They're finding matchups that way. And I think it's like, oh, dang, like that's different. And I think it just shows some flexibility. So that's the thing I'm really excited about is, one of the elements of the air raid that I think can add value is having a running quarterback, because it affects the pass rush in a positive way. It affects the coverage structure in a positive way, because it simplifies everything. So if you get a simpler coverage structure because of the player back there, that's great. And I think also, what Philly did with Jalen Hurts, to me, is a little bit more like traditional spread, or like Chip Kelly spread, meaning you're in spread to run the ball. You know what I'm saying? Like you're spreading out to remove defenders from the box, so that I, who have a big, strong quarterback and a running back here, we are now in an advantage position. And so I want to see what they do with that, because if you sprinkle in a little bit of that, that is further going to increase the advantage of what you can do from the air raid. Because one of the things that you see teams doing now is they're like, screw it. We've got these great nickel players. We've got these great dime players. We've got these great space players. And we've got enough talent on the defensive line that we don't need to worry about them running the football. But now, if you bring in some of those elements from Philly, where it's like, hey, we can run, NFL triple option, where we get, a zone read element. The quarterback boot breaks contain as a runner, but there's also a pass concept out here where we can also throw the football. Like, I can't play a bunch of very defensive structures to that. My blitzes have to be locked in. My contain rules have to be locked in. So you're cultivating simplicity that favors the air raid principles in general, right? Couple that, I don't think you should do this with Jalen, but quarterback power, quarterback counter. If you throw those in once or twice a game and you hit people with them, like I forget what game it was. I think it might have been the Seattle game. Kyler Murray, they ran a quarterback draw with him, and it went for a touchdown. It was like it's like a 65-yard touchdown. Like, you better believe for the rest of the game, it's like we're not in two-man. We've got eyes on the quarterback. And those are the elements where I think, like you talked about, Brian Johnson, Anthony Lynn, that infusion of kind of innovative quarterback run stuff, gun run stuff.
Shout out Bobby Johnson, too, who's done that with Josh Allen and Daniel Jones in Buffalo, New York.
100%. So that's the thing I think that could, again, tip this in a very positive way for these offensive principles. Again, I'm going to call it NFL air raid. It's and by that I mean it's just a little bit more spread. Their NFL concepts. They understand the pros and cons of it. But to me, that element of the quarterback run, the gun run stuff, and like the traditional Chip Kelly spread stuff, could be totally game changing for this offense.
Last thing on this, then we'll get to Commanders specific for the last few minutes here. A great quote from Leach in that NFL Films feature. He's like, what I would want to do is 1 week just pass the football 100% of the time. And then the next week, run it 100% of the time, and then brag afterwards about how balanced our offense is.
Yeah.
So it gives you an idea of kind of how, the revolutionary type of thinking that they were doing, and just like, hey, let's find the matchup and let's murder it.
Yeah. 100%.
And so that's the Pirate. What a gift. What a gift. All right, so the last piece of the puzzle, Logan, for this air raid offense is what Washington does with it. You've got Terry McLaurin, you've got Jahan Dotson, you've got Luke McCaffrey on the receiver end of it, and then obviously a couple more guys we can talk about if they come up. And most importantly, you have Jayden Daniels, a quarterback who has seen his decision-making ability just skyrocket throughout his career, and especially last year, a guy who's very used to taking advantage of advantageous matchups, a guy whose legs can help create advantageous matchups. How do you like kind of the marriage of the offensive minds and certainly Kliff at the forefront of that and all the things we've talked about for the last 40 minutes with the skill players in the 2024 Washington Commanders? Yeah,
well, I think it's important to note that like the air raid is the NFL in 2024, probably. Like it's spread out. People are throwing the ball 60% of the time. Defenses are in nickel more than ever. You mentioned how there's a slight transition back to running the football, right? But I think like this is what the NFL is. And so I want as many talented one-on-one winning matchups as I can possibly cultivate. So can Terry do that? Yeah. Can Jahan do that? Yeah. Can Luke McCaffrey? Probably, but remains to be seen. But I would assume.
One thing I'll say about Luke too is like he's a former quarterback, and so we talk about the fact that there's all these sight adjustments and reads. Yeah, it's very different making those from the pocket versus you can speak to this far better than I can, but running a route at full speed and reading what the defense is doing is not easy. But like at least conceptually, he's got an advanced understanding because he's a former quarterback.
No, 1,000%. And then I think you got a guy like Zach Ertz who, when I watch practice, we talked about this the other day, but like just the stems, the ability to break leverages of the defense, the double stick, the dark arts of route running, like you've got some guys here that can win these matchups. And I think you've got a guy in Jayden, that understands like how to distribute the football. Like he gets it, like we talk about his processing, and that's ultimately what you're getting out of this offense, right? It's like quick decisions, balls out. And so again, that's really exciting for me to kind of think about that. And the other thing, I love his intellect. And I think people sleep on like the ability for a quarterback at the line of scrimmage to be like, I want to run this concept versus this shell structure, and I'm going to signal it and we're going to get that executed. That can be absolutely devastating if the guy knows what he's doing. And again, versus kind of these simpler structures they're getting early in OTAs, I think Jalen's done a really good job of that. So I'm really excited about that. And then I think the thing that is going to, that I will want to see is just their ability to get to certain runs from these spread out formations. Because, we talked about like, they've already shown that they're not straight air raid because of the formations, the bunches, the shifts, the variety of what they bring to the table. But I think that's the thing is like, how do you continue to hurt defenses and put them in conflict? Because if you're just presenting the same thing, I can adjust. I'm smart enough. I'm fast enough. I know how to adjust to the same thing. But how varied can I present each and every week? And I think in 2021, we just talked about that. He showed a really high affinity to doing that. But now you've got this piece in the backfield that's unique and different than Kyler Murray. He can see the whole field. He can attack the middle of the football field. He can run. He can be a part of the quarterback design. Right? It's just a nice element that needs to be used to the fullest. And hopefully that's what we see.
Yeah, and ultimately their success offensively, this was always true, but especially with a system like this, is Jayden Daniels' ability to process.
Right.
How quickly and how correctly can Jayden Daniels process the things that he needs to? Is he on the same page with the receivers? Does he make the right reads? Does he see the things pre-snap that he thinks he sees and then either confirm and go or adjust and get to the next thing or realize what he needs, where he needs to be. And I think that was one of the things that's really impressive about Jayden in OTAs so far is, we think of progressions as like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it's like, no, sometimes it's 1's dead because the coverage is X, which means I need to go to 4 now. And 4 is going to be open. And not always, by the way, because that's where those complex structures come in, where it's like, oh, it's cover 2 on over here. That means I need to go to the cover 4 side. Or this should be open over here. And like, oh crap, it's cover 4 over there, or cover 3 over there, or man over there. Because like, we talk about cover 6, cover 9, and it's like, oh, it's just 1 versus 2 high safeties and whatever happens. It's like, no, sometimes they play completely different coverages on both sides in modern NFL defenses. But also they try to simplify it down. Like, is middle field open? Is it not? So there's like things like that Kliff is trying. You hear Kliff talk about in OTAs when they're running, even routes on air, right? Because if you're running routes on air, you can run it however you want, unless your coach is like, no, pretend that this is the coverage. And so they'll be like, all right, we're running this concept, middle field open. And that tells all the receivers where to bend those routes. And ultimately, Jayden and the receivers have to be right on that. The one last piece I wanted to ask you about is, what does this do for the O-line? And there's probably like a whole, if we wanted to get really nerdy, like podcast episode on offensive lines and air raids and the splits and like what that does and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately for Washington, with a unit that is much maligned, with a unit that a lot of people think they didn't do enough to upgrade, with a unit with, even for those of us that are not nearly as concerned as people in full on freak out mode, there's questions like who's going to play left tackle is a question. Right. What does this system and the way that you think they'll run it, run pass balance to splits to play calls to the quickness of it all, what does this do for this O-line?
Yeah, I think that's going to be up to the play caller, 100% up to the play caller, because I think what you're looking for is, again, ways to protect the offensive line. And obviously my experience is one where we're going to run the ball 46% of the time. We're going to be okay punting the football. We're going to run a lot of play action. We're going to find chunk plays on short to intermediate concepts and then work for yak down the field afterwards. That's how Kyle did it. That's how Sean did it. That's what those offenses do, which is great. But in the air raid system, it's a little bit different. It's quick game. And again, they want to get guys in space so they can work after the catch. It was really interesting listening to some of the descriptions of air raid because I'm like, that's what Kyle wants to do. He wants to get guys who are good with the ball in their hands in space. He just does it a different way. And so, again, I think that's a huge element. I think the quarterback run stuff is going to be a huge element. I think the quick release of Jayden is going to be a huge element of that. And then understanding like when and where I can take shots, like understanding like, oh, I've got this kind of protection package in, like I can take a shot here, or this is the down and distance, or this is where they like to bring this certain pressure that we're going to have a hard time with in our 5-man pro. Like, let's make sure we've got a play call up that we like. So again, I can't overstate the importance of Kliff's role in that offensive line group. Like, we might not even be talking about them by the end of the year, and they might be just an average group. But if you're calling plays effectively, like, it works. And I think when you look at like the Miami Dolphins before Mike McDaniels got there, was the worst group in the NFL. He got there, and it wasn't like they brought in a whole bunch of new pieces. They kept the same guys. They just called plays differently, and they emphasized different things from that group. And Tua got the ball out of his hand incredibly quickly, and now no one even talks about them. It's not even a point of conversation because they understand how to deleverage them. Same thing with Kyle. Like, when you look on paper, obviously they have Trent Williams, but outside of them, they're not. It's not like the great like this great wall of humanity. It's the play caller, and so that's where Kliff and his understanding of what those guys can and can't do, when and how he can do things, is going to be incredibly important for that group's success.
No doubt. We'll obviously be breaking this down all year long. So if you're not subscribed to Take Command, now is a good time. Also, you got no more listening to do because the podcast is basically over. We'll be back next week. Just a one pod a week for us. I'm doing some travel at the tail end of the week. So hope that you enjoy this, and we'll be back with our regularly scheduled 2 pods next week. For Logan, who you can follow for much more on Instagram at Logan_Paulson82. I am Craig Hoffman, and we will see you next time on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.